everyone. Can you hear me in the back all right? Yep, great. All right. So I want to start today by asking you this question. Where have our forests gone? Let's just consider this photo for a second. This is not meant to depress you. This is going to be, we're going to go up from here and get encouraged after this. But if we look at this, we can see what you often would see on the New Zealand landscape if you go traveling. If you're looking out the window of a car or a bus or a plane and you just see these expanses of introduced plant species and a changed landscape, right? So our indigenous forest is greatly reduced. New Zealand used to be a land of forests, and now it's got some forests and some other things going on. And my question is, why is this really a problem, right? Like, we did this on purpose. There must be some good things to it, right? But in fact, there's a little bit of a problem because ecosystem services are reduced as well. So by ecosystem services, I'm talking about all the benefits that people get from intact natural areas, from ecosystems that are native to the landscape. So these include things like clean drinking water, decomposition of waste, food from plants, and there's actually a very long list of all of the ecosystem services that we get from nature. Now, a lot of research today is showing that these services come from intact natural areas most efficiently from these areas. And so actually we can assign a monetary value to our native ecosystems. This is often talked about in terms like natural capital. So there's these ecosystem services, filtering of our air and our water, carbon sequestration, which is really a big deal right now. But there are other things as well that we get from our natural areas. So we have social cohesion in places where people go out to walk their dogs or hang out with the neighbors. People get to know each other more. They're more likely to go outside if there's nice green spaces to go to. And of course, hand in hand with that, we have health and recreation benefits. So I know, for one, I would rather go for a run in a forest than next to a big motorway, right? So if you have green spaces, people will use them more, and it's good for them. And then finally, of course, New Zealand has an amazing biological heritage. Compared with other countries, we are very unique. And so if we look to preserve and restore our native ecosystems, we are actually leaving a legacy for those who are coming after us. And that's really important for them. So hence the field of restoration ecology, this idea that yes, we can actually bring back some of the native ecosystems that we once had on our landscape. Restoration ecology has only been around for a few decades, maybe 30, 40 years. It's been growing and gaining steam around the world as a field of study. And the idea is that it's a way of looking scientifically at how to repair damaged ecosystems. And usually these are places that were damaged through human disruption, so we can come back and intervene and then repair them as well. I want to contrast this with the concept of conservation biology, which we're probably a little bit more familiar with. It's an older field. And conservation biology is wonderful in its own right, but it's more focused on preserving what's already there, right? Preventing ongoing degradation. Whereas restoration ecology is saying, hey, we can actually bring it back to a place, to a native state from maybe it's been disrupted or degraded in some way. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Okay, so I'm going to take this a step further now, and Bruce talked about this a little bit before, this idea of urban ecology, and I'm part of this growing group of people who believes that we can do restoration ecology in cities, and I in particular look at doing forest restoration in cities. The reason for this is that there are a lot of people in a lot of cities all around the world, and it's growing and growing and growing. So it's predicted that by 2050, as much as 64% of the world's population could be in cities. And in New Zealand, like Bruce said before, 87% of us already live in cities. So why shouldn't we have beautiful green cities where we can flourish and enjoy our lifestyles and also have our biodiversity on our doorsteps? This study came out last year. The title of this research paper was "Strategically Growing the Urban Forest Will Improve Our World." And in this study, they looked at the value of trees in megacities. So they studied 10 megacities, and they found out that for every square kilometer of tree cover, you actually save money on the utilities and some of the things that would normally be expensive in cities. So, for example, in Tokyo here, just the burden that's relieved on people's health that's impacted by air pollution, by trees, is about $17 billion. So it's very hard to sometimes measure these effects. They're somewhat intangible, but there are a lot of things that trees do for us, and many more, that actually improve our lives and save us money. So this isn't just a, like, oh, we love trees, they're pretty, but actually it's very practical to have trees amongst the infrastructure of your urban areas. So that makes me think about this question. Is New Zealand benefiting from urban forest as much as it could? And you probably can guess what my answer to that is. So let's carry on. So what if we viewed cities not as a problem for biodiversity, which is kind of a lot of times what we have done historically, right? Cities are for people, and outside the city is for the other wild things. But we could think about cities as part of the solution, I think. We can promote our biodiversity. We can make these green spaces for recreation for people to enjoy, get outside. We can get those lovely ecosystem services that I talked about earlier. And people like what they know, right? So if people get to know their natural heritage on their doorsteps, they're going to advocate for it in other places out in the wild where maybe they've never been because they know it from their own backyards, from their local park. So there are three main keys to success that I like to promote when setting out to do restoration work in a city. The first one Bruce touched on already. So this is moving from that revegetation mindset to a restoration mindset to capture all of the benefits. So not just plunking some plants in the ground and saying, yep, tick the box, we're off, but actually working with an area to recreate an ecosystem. It takes a little bit longer, but what you get is 10 times better. In cities, there are a lot of us all working together, right? Or we would like to hope we would all work together. So I think there's a little bit more time that's needed, patience, respect to engage with all the stakeholders involved. And so even though this might take a little bit more effort, it's definitely worth it for the long term. And then finally, if you really want to have long-term success with your restoration work, it's very important to have a scientific underpinning for what you're doing. So that will actually enable you to be more efficient, save money, save time, not get frustrated when things just won't work, but actually look at what the science says and apply it. So I have a couple examples of that here. Bruce has also touched on that too, so he gave a really good introduction for the talk. One of the things you can do is use the successional framework, so the pioneering species followed by later successional species. And also, there's a lot of lessons we can take from plant competition theory and also knowing about plant traits. We can use those to our advantage when we kind of engineer, we think about what plants to put where, that they will have the best chances at fighting back against the weeds, because we all know there are going to be a lot of weeds there for them to deal with. So that's a couple of examples, but there are a lot of scientific principles that we should not ignore, that we can actually use to our benefit as tools when we restore. Right, so I'm going to jump into the research aim of People, Cities, and Nature that I help lead, and that's the plantings research aim. And it's not just me, we have a whole team of people. So here you can see myself and some of the other leaders, and also some of our wonderful students who work so hard and really are passionate about collecting the data for this project. Our role here is to be a bridge. We sit in that red circle of restoration ecology. And above us, we have the body, the world of ecological theory. So this is like all the super nerds. And then down here, people who are doing the work on the ground, boots on the ground, planting plants, making it happen. And so what we aim to do is help to develop ecological theory by studying this and learning from what's happening on the ground, but also be a conduit to take ecological theory and help translate it into practice as well. So this is that bridge that hopefully will help everybody if we are able to make it happen. With our research, we are using a chronosequence approach. And with this idea, we look at forests that are just planted, all the way up to ones that have been planted for a long time. So the oldest restored or reconstructed forest patch that we study is actually 58 years old, and it's in Dunedin. So that's great, because those people were really, they had a lot of foresight, and they planted a long time ago, and now we can study that forest. And the reason that we use this approach is, one, because I don't have time to plant a forest and wait for 50 years to study it. And also because we want to understand how these forests are changing as they age, because then we can actually manage them better to achieve what we want with the long-term success of having a forest, and having a forest that grows and then self-perpetuates. So we're not gardening and gardening forever and ever. So our goal is to study regeneration in forests that have been planted completely from scratch. So usually into a paddock, sometimes they're on tips. We have one here in Invercargill that was planted on the old dump. And we've been looking at these temporal dynamics of the plantings, especially we've been looking at the climate, or the microclimate, as it were, within each planting, and also the community composition. So what are the conditions that foster those plants to be there, and maybe how can we manage those to encourage those forests to regenerate? So this is actually kind of a classic indicator that you've been successful in restoring a forest. If you see native tree regeneration, especially late successional trees growing, and epiphytes colonizing again. And I know there's some epiphytes down here, there's more up north, but the thing that ties these two things together, the native tree regeneration and the epiphyte colonization, is that these are late successional plant species, and they're very picky about where they grow. They need to have just the right conditions. And so you have aced it if you have them starting to grow on their own, because you've created a forest that's hospitable to them. Some of the work that we've done previously looking at this has investigated these ideas of, well, there must be certain variables, certain things in the ecosystem that drive this to occur, that these late successional plant species can establish. So in this study, from my PhD work, we looked at, peek into what's coming. We've looked at tree regeneration density and epiphyte density as these indicators, so the response variables, the things we want to see happening, but the question is what makes them happen? And we found when we did the statistical modeling that there are three things that were really key. So for trees, it was soil temperature fluctuations being stabilized. So not big swings from day to night. We don't want that. The little baby trees cannot handle super cold, super hot, cycling back and forth. So as soon as a forest canopy develops, it's kind of like an insulative blanket, and it stabilizes those conditions and allows them to grow. And then we found, of course, as you would probably guess, that herbaceous weeds are very problematic and they outcompete the native seedlings as well. For epiphytes, the main, most important microclimate variable, or of all variables, was the humidity, just because their roots are prone to desiccating, they're very exposed. So as soon as humidity hit constant levels under the forest canopy, epiphytes were able to start coming back and growing on their own. So the most exciting thing to me, though, of this research was finding out that canopy openness is what drives everything else. So mathematically, we found that actually it determines these other variables, and therefore all we have to do is manage for that canopy to get closed as soon as may be in order to kill the herbaceous weeds by blocking the sunlight and create those really nice microclimate conditions that are just right. So this is kind of what that would look like across time. So we may have a site where we planted some trees, but there's still a really open canopy. It's very exposed. And then over time, the trees grow, the boughs of the trees reach out towards one another, and they're reaching for the sun and taking up as much sun as they can, right? And so the canopy is forming. And then finally, in a mature forest, which we've all been in, I'm sure, it's actually not as light, right? It's more insulated, and the canopy is fully intact over top of your head. And so that's really what we want. That's what we're looking for in restoration. And until you reach that, you really haven't met your goal yet. You haven't kind of said, yep, okay, I can say this is done, I can walk away from it. So there's a lot of steps to manage until you get there. One of the rules that we advocate is the 1-in-1 rule, which is to plant really densely. And so for this, it's about 1 plant for every square meter, and plant tall, because you're going to get the canopy closure sooner, and the plant's going to be above the herbaceous weeds. So plant things that are about 1 meter tall when you put them in the ground. And so this seems, like sometimes when I talk about this, I hear gasps, because it seems like, yes, this is really dense, and these are pretty big plants to be planting. But we're playing the long game, right? So it may be more expensive and time-consuming to put these in at first, but we're thinking decades ahead, or we should be. So what we want to do is make sure we're going to lock in that growth and that canopy as soon as we can to secure that area. So another thing we wanted to know is not just what are the most important variables for these little trees to regenerate, but when do these conditions start to occur, right? Because then we can manage for those as well. And we can know how to expect, and we can budget and know our timelines for our projects. So I hope you can see this okay, but what we're looking at here is these 4 variables that I just showed you in the earlier graph. So back here. So this one, this one, this one, and this one. So these are the main drivers that get us what we want, that are these indicators of success. So we wanted to know over time, when do these conditions start to become just right? And if we look at the x-axis of these graphs, this is the time since restoration. So it was a paddock, or it was a blank slate of some sort, we could say, when we planted the plants. And then how long after that do we start to get the canopy openness levels, or humidity, or soil temperature levels that we want? So for canopy openness, you can see there's a pretty steep decline early on, a drop, and that makes sense, right? The trees are growing, hopefully they're growing and not dying, and they're forming a canopy, so it's closing. There's not as much openness. And then following that, there's a drop in fluctuations of humidity. So this isn't a drop in humidity levels, we're talking about the fluctuation, the oscillations. So they're dampening, so we're getting a little bit of leveling out here, where humidity is staying more constant all the time. And then for soil temperature, it's following suit. And herbaceous weed cover is also kind of mirroring canopy openness and dropping, as we might expect, because the sunlight is being taken away, so it can't grow. Now, the really interesting thing we found is there seems to be a 20-year threshold. And the analysis that we did here was what's called a breakpoint analysis. So there's actually a statistical difference at about 20 years for each of these variables. So this means that as we manage our plantings, our restoration projects, 20 years could be a really important point at which we're able to step back maybe a little bit. We don't have to manage as intensively because we've locked in some of these conditions where native seedlings can start to grow. Now, I will add that this data set is from New Plymouth and Hamilton. So this is the North Island story. Now, I'm really curious to see if we have a 20-year threshold down here, or if it might be 25 years or something different. So, also, the takeaway is that we can manage this. We don't have to just sit back and say, oh, well, I hope we get to the threshold soon. But we can actually manage forest ecosystems to get across these thresholds. So it's kind of like, you could think about like a race or something like that if you want. Like, let's get to that point, because then we're going to be more likely to be secured in our project. Right, so we've been collecting data to look at these sorts of ideas across all of New Zealand in 9 different cities that you can see here. And the idea was to get a spread in the latitude so that we can see how the different climate is affecting plantings in different places. There are 9 research plots in every city, so yep, 81 plots across the whole country. And all of these are in forests that were planted completely from scratch and full of native plants. Here you can see where we've got some sites in Invercargill, and all of these plots are permanent. So the idea is that they can be remeasured, kind of like the National Vegetation Survey throughout wilder parts of New Zealand. This is the urban counterpart to that hopefully we can go back and remeasure for a long time. And all of the plots are therefore on public or covenanted land so that we can have access to them for a long time. And here in Invercargill, they range from about 8 years old since planting to 23 years old. And I want to give a shout out to Brian and Chris because they were really helpful in finding these plots. And because we come to a city, but we have to know how old these plantings are. There's no way to know that really. So it's really great when people on the ground can say, yeah, we know that was the year that those plants were put in at first. So I'll just walk you through a few of the sites. Here's Thompson Bush. We have 2 research plots there. One's 8 years old, one's 10 years old. One next to Waiheke River. There it is, 12 years old. 2 out on the dockland at Bushy Point, 13 years old and 17 years old. And 2 on the Ramesses Covenanted land that are some of our old ones, which is really great. It's always a bit more of a struggle to find plantings that were done a long time ago. Oh yeah, this is where our field trip is later in our afternoon tea. So you'll actually get to see some of these research plots. There's a site actually next to Kew Bush. There was an augmentation planting done, so we just managed to squash one of our plots in there, and we're studying that as well. And then Estuary Walkway, which I mentioned before, and that one's about 22 years old. So in each of these plots, we measure canopy openness. So I've been talking about that as a major driver of regeneration in these forests. So we have a look at how open is the canopy, and that's an index of light availability and also that microclimate. And then we measure microclimate directly. So we put out data loggers like you see here and here. This one gets tied to trees and this one gets buried in the ground. And we look at the humidity, the air temperature, the soil temperature. And just this week I've been collecting those data loggers, and they've been out in the plots for a full year. And they've been taking a snapshot of the conditions every 4 hours. So a lot of data, but it's good. We also measure all of the basal area of trees that are in our plots, and we identify what species they are. And then the all-important tree seedling regeneration. So we have a look at what's actually growing on the forest floor. And then we estimate herbaceous ground cover. This is what our plots look like. They are 10 meters by 20 meters in size. And we wanted to go for the 20 by 20 like the National Vegetation Survey, but it's actually hard to find enough plots if you restrict it that much. So this is a good shape because it's kind of a riparian shape, and we tend to find plots, areas where plots can fit across the country. So we do want to have that standardized. So all the plots across the whole country and all of the urban restoration plantings are 10 by 20 meters. We look at trees in the whole thing. We survey all of the trees, then it's saplings in each of these subunit areas, and then seedlings in these circles. And it seems like not a lot of area, but when you have a lot of seedlings, oh boy, it takes a while. And then the data loggers are present in the center of the plot, and we have one for redundancy here on the corner as well. And I actually thought that more of our data loggers would go missing than they have, but we've done really well and been able to retrieve almost all of them. At this point, all of the plots were set up last summer, and comprehensive vegetation surveys were done then, and that's when we put out our data loggers to get our year of microclimate data. And last summer, we tagged and identified almost 4,000 trees. So every single tree in our study has its unique identifier number tag on it. So this way we can trace individuals across time if we want to and see, is this tree has grown, what's happening with it. And as of yesterday, the Invercargill data collection was finished. I brought in the last data loggers in the rain, but it's done. And we've just started doing a little bit of preliminary data analysis, so I'm going to just show you a snapshot of that today, but it's really at the preliminary stages. So I'm sorry because this is hard to see, so I'll describe it as much as I can for you. So I'm going to show you the 4 variables that I've been harking on about for a while here. So tree basal area is actually one of the first ones I'm going to talk about. And so the age of the restored forests is here on the x-axis, and then basal area is shown on the y-axis. And these blue dots are the 9 plots here in Invercargill. And the takeaway from this is, so basal area is kind of the area of the tree trunk, so it's the area that the tree is taking on the landscape. And so here what we see is that as the forest ages, trees get bigger. Surprise. So, okay, but there's more and there's more. So when that happens, when the trees get wider around, we find that the canopy openness drops. And so this is where it gets interesting. This is what we're trying to get at, right? We want to see that as that canopy openness drops over time, some of those other things start happening, like seedlings start to regenerate, herbaceous ground cover starts to senesce because it can't grow anymore. So for Invercargill, it's been kind of an interesting first glance because the herbaceous ground cover has, for the most part, followed that trend. So here's some younger sites where it's dropping. But there's 2 outliers that are making things a little bit crazy. So Waihopai River planting here has extremely low herbaceous ground cover for its age, but it was planted really densely. So when you go visit it, like I did the other day, it's just got really close canopy and not much growing under it as far as herbaceous weeds, but it has lots of seedlings growing. As you can see here, this is seedlings at the Waihopai River planting, and they're just pretty much the most dense I've ever seen in the whole country. It's amazing. And we're trying to figure out why that is. Maybe it's a good stopping point for birds, I'm not sure, a little bit of a stepping stone. But it's been very curious to see that that's happening. So, so it gets a red arrow. Now, I wanted to show you these big orange dots, which are what you would expect to find in an urban forest remnant. So not in a place that's been planted, but in a patch of forest that's been left on the landscape. And you can see that in some of these cases, we're approaching that value. So Estuary Walkway here has basal area getting close in some places. Usually the canopy openness is a little bit lower than any of the sites that are planted here so far, and so on. So I'm getting there. Now here's the same variables again, but I've thrown in points from Tauranga and Napier as a bit of a comparison, and also done a linear regression model. And so Invercargill's in blue, and Tauranga and Napier are in red, and otherwise it's the same layout. And I just want you to look at the overall pattern here. That's probably all you can actually see, but I want you to just see how there is this significant relationship here between forest age and basal area, and that as we're adding more points, it's becoming a smoother and cleaner relationship. And that's nice because it allows us to predict what will happen. And when we can predict what will happen, then we can manage for things better. And so there's a similar trend, but a downward trend for canopy openness, that there's this sweeping closure of the canopy over time. So I'm interested in getting the full 9 cities together, and so we have lots and lots of dots on these graphs and seeing if they actually present a really cohesive picture. Herbaceous ground cover gets a little bit more all over the place, and I think that's because of some differences in management in some of the different cities. And then tree seedling regeneration, again, we've got Waihopai River plot here, but otherwise it's kind of an upward trend, so what we want to see, more seedlings regenerating over time. And is there a 20-year threshold? It's not as clean here. I haven't done a breakpoint analysis yet. I want to do that when all of the data is together in one data set. So we're working on that because, again, I'm curious, is 20 years going to be the case here, like it is in the North Island, or will be a different timeline maybe? So just to summarize, if you're looking at your restoration project, you're looking at the age of your forest, tree size is going to go up over time, right? And hopefully canopy openness will drop in tandem with that because the trees are getting bigger and the crowns of the trees are growing. And then following that, herbaceous weed cover should drop as well because those weeds just can't live in the shade as well. And then you get tree seedling regeneration. You get the nice microclimate and you get them growing. And that is when you've really hit the jackpot and you're getting what you want. And an important takeaway here is, and also 20-year threshold works in the North Island, maybe here. We need to be thinking long-term here, so this is not something that you just go out in your backyard and you do for the next 5 years, but this is something that we can invest in over our lives. And as a wise person once said, It takes more than one generation to build a forest, so we need to be teaching our kids about this as well, and teaching them to value and look after these places. I'm going to leave you with a few slides of tips and tricks. So this is where you can get out your phone and snap a few shots if you want. Photography is encouraged, not prohibited. So I know that Brian will follow up on this a bit later, but it's quite important to start at your desk. Don't just jump outside straight away. Start at your desk. Make a plan with some clear goals and steps and how you can achieve them. Plant successionally, so following that scientific underpinning. Plant natives, because you get the full suite of benefits that come with native plants that have co-evolved on our landscape. And put the right plant in the right place. This is definitely a big theme of today, I think. Follow the 1-in-1 rule, and you can do some herbaceous weed control that may be helpful in the beginning, but after a while you're going to start just spraying your seedlings that are coming back, so you need to be careful not to do that. And really important is don't just walk away and forget about these places, but monitor them. See if you're getting what you want. If you're not, then change your management and do something different, because every place is a little bit different. If you want some more resources, you can go to our website. We have some resources there on peoplecitiesnature.co.nz. And also, I'm a huge advocate of the International Society for Ecological Restoration, and you can find standards for restoration there. And you can now become a certified restoration practitioner if you want. And there's lots of people going through this certification program. And then you can tote that when you want to go out and do a restoration project or something like that, or get a contract. And then finally, of course, there's things that you can do here in Invercargill, working in your local reserve and that, doing volunteer stuff. And also making submissions so that the people who are making decisions for our plans are empowered to be the right people, to make the right decisions to restore green spaces on our landscapes. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the councils that work with us, and thank you very much for your time today.